with Miss Maudie, and then they go back into the tea and really maintain their composure and their control, even in this crisis situation, which is actually something Scout admires. So there is a sense now that Scout's having more, she's more attracted to certain female role models like Miss Maudie, like elements of Alexandra and elements of Calpurnia as well. Now, this is a second-hand recount. Dill and Jem actually encounter Atticus on his way to deliver the news to Helen, and they're allowed to go with him. They have to stay in the car, but they do see her drop to her knees, and she collapses as she's obviously horrified by the news of her husband's death. And we also hear about Mr. Underwood, who was guarding the prison when the mob arrived to lynch Tom Robinson. Interesting character, a good example of the contradictory views at that time, because he doesn't like to mix with black people, but he was there prepared to defend Tom with his shotgun against the mob. And now he does condemn the verdict in his strongly worded editorial. He's the voice of the Macon Tribune. He just prints his rants, essentially. It's very much his personal views. And he's the person that explicitly compares Tom's death to the needless slaughter of songbirds. The title of the novel, The Mockingbird, which is really a symbolic indication of the needless death. The birds just sing, they don't do any harm, they're peaceful. Just like Tom was respectful, he didn't challenge the status quo, he wasn't a problem, and yet he's been killed. He's died because of, well, no reason other than what Mr. Underwood calls senseless slaughter, these horrible attitudes that people have towards that community. In chapter 26, Macon very quickly, within a few days, really was forgotten about the trial, moved on. Of course, Bob Ewell hasn't forgotten about it. He's gone back to collecting his welfare checks, but he still harbours a grudge against Atticus. Alexandra does worry about that, but Atticus, perhaps a little bit complacent, thinks that Bob has got it out of the system. Scout at school, we return to her experience now with Miss Gates. She's appalled by the fascism and the attitudes of Hitler, the racist, and prejudice attitudes of the Nazis. But Miss Gates, while she condemns the Hitler and the Nazis, she says that prejudice doesn't exist in America, and obviously it does. She's someone that said that Tom got what he deserved at the end of the trial. So again, a contradiction. How can she say there's no prejudice in America when the black people are treated with such disdain and the trial was obviously not fair? Chapter 27, a couple of things that Bob does then in revenge. He breaks into Judge Taylor's house. We're not actually, it doesn't say explicitly that it was Bob, but it more than likely was. And he harasses Helen Robinson. Link Dees, who used to employ Tom, who was a reliable employee, stands up for Helen and threatens Bob with the law. So he warns him off. Link Dees is kind of a hero in the novel as well. He also stands up for Tom during the trial. He shouts out. Judge Taylor doesn't like it, but he does shout out to try and defend Tom's reputation. Alexandra now worries, as I say, more about Atticus, but Atticus reassures her there won't be any problems. And Mrs. Merriweather, the children going to a Halloween pageant after the pranks that followed when there was nothing put on for the children the years before. So there's an organised pageant at the school. Scout has to go dressed as a ham. Now, Scout, a little bit of humour in the novel. Scout misses her cue, and she feels really bad about that, but Jem reassures her it's not that bad, and then he walks her home at night. Atticus didn't go with them, so they are unaccompanied. They're exposed, really. And Atticus, remember, is in his house. He says listening to music, so he doesn't hear their calls. It's actually, Scout thinks when they hear footsteps behind them that it's Cecil Jacobs, one of the boys from school, following them. And she screams and shouts at him and doesn't really get too worried. But then they are attacked. Jem has his arm broken, and then it seems that Scout is grabbed by somebody, obviously someone drunk, and it's obviously Bob Ewell. Then another unknown man intervenes in the scuffle, and Scout really doesn't have a clear idea of who or what is going on, but the reader can work this out. Clearly, this is Boo intervening. He's the hero now. And it's Boo that carries Jem home When Jem and the children get home, Dr. Reynolds sedates him, and Heck reveals that Bob Ewell has been found stabbed to death. He's got a knife in his stomach. Now, Scout gives her quite confused account, as I say, and finally she recognises Boo. So this is a real climax. This is opening her eyes. This phantom that she's always wanted to see finally is unveiled, and he's in her house. Now, this is perhaps one of the few errors or blind spots that Atticus has. He thinks that Jem actually killed Bob Ewell. In reality, of course, it was Boo, and Heck really does have to try hard to open Atticus's eyes to that obvious truth. But Heck, as I mentioned, decides to cover this up. He doesn't want Boo to be exposed to the attention, even though it would be gratitude of the community for saving the children. But he sees that as a sin because Boo is obviously so withdrawn. He's a recluse. He wouldn't appreciate it. Would be a real nightmare experience for him to be exposed to that much attention. So he decides to say that it was an accident that Bob Ewell fell on his knife. Okay, and Heck takes very defensive of that. He wants to stand up for what is right because he knows that the trial was wrong. And finally, the end of the novel. Scout walks Boo home, and he seems very weak and childish. There is a great sense of sympathy for him there. And then interestingly, she turns around and she sees the neighbourhood from his perspective. Atticus talks quite a few references to this throughout the novel about getting a sense of someone else's perspective and someone else's life, getting inside their skin and walking around in it. And here's the obvious example. Scout looks and sees what Boo would have seen for all those years, the children playing and all sorts of incidents recounted from the novel so far, and really gets a strong sense of what his life must be like in there. So she's matured and she's gained a strong sense of empathy there. So that's the plot summary. You see the grey lines indicate the tension in the novel. The peaks there in part 1 with the gunshot just here, okay, when Nathan Radley fires when the children are trespassing on the Radley lot, and here obviously with the trial and the verdict, and here again a peak with the attack from Bob Ewell. Now, the context of the novel, so some historical background. First of all, on the author, Harper Lee. So this was one of the only novels, she only wrote one novel. It actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 1961, America's Top Literary Award. She based it on her own experiences. She grew up in Alabama, which is one of these southern states, just here. And it took place, at the same time as her childhood, really. She was born in 1926, so she would have lived through the 30s and been about Scout's age. Like Jem and Scout, her father was a lawyer. She studied at university in Alabama and then worked in New York. That's when she started work on To Kill a Mockingbird in the 1950s. That was just before the major black civil rights movement got momentum and the campaigning for black rights into the 60s. Now, this symbol here, this is the Confederate flag. All these southern states down here, these were the states that after the Civil War, the North won the Civil War within America in the 1800s. The southern states still retained a lot of racist attitudes. Still to this day, arguably, there are some racist attitudes everywhere, of course, but at this time in the 1930s, the South was particularly intolerant of the black community. Another factor in the novel, particularly with regard to the Ewells and the Cunninghams, the unemployment and the suffering of the farmers, was the Great Depression at that time. Now, the stock market, the economy really crashed Black Thursday in 1929, and that caused a great deal of unemployment, as well as what was called the Dust Bowl effect, the negative climatic effects in the 1930s, where a lot of the farms were ruined by drought and windstorms. So this is an indication of just how badly the economy suffered in 1929. So obviously it took quite a few years to recover. So in the 1930s, unemployment was very high, earnings were very low, and as I say, the Cunninghams represent the farmers who suffered the most, as Atticus says, in the crash. And here we are, we've got some of the dole queues, people queuing up, the unemployed, free coffee and donuts. So a lot of people struggling just to make ends meet at that time in the 1930s. Okay, so also now a sense here of the divisions within the community based on race, but also based on class. So as I said before, Alexandra is the strongest advocate of these class attitudes. At the bottom, of course, the black community, Tom Robinson, Helen Robinson, Reverend Sykes even a member of the clergy. The black community are regarded as the very bottom of the social hierarchy, as an underclass at this time. The Yules just above them, even though they are white trash. Their attitudes are abhorrent, and they don't really take care of the description of their own yard is a mess. All sorts of things lying around littering the yard. They don't take any pride in where they live, and obviously they're very ignorant and uneducated. Above them, as I've just mentioned, the Cunninghams, the farmers who do work hard. And as I say, this is the tier, the group of people that might be starting to swing things and change their attitudes, because it's the Cunningham that delays the guilty verdict. And the Finches, Atticus, top of the tree, as it were, top of the hierarchy. Certainly, this is what Alexandra would say, and she wants to keep them there. And Scout and Jem really have to debate what it is that makes these divisions in society. What is background? Is it about people's ability to read and write? Is it about where their ancestors came from? Is it level of education? What is it exactly? What are the factors that divide people like this? And it's an interesting debate that they have. Okay, so obviously I've touched on that there, the racist attitudes in the 1930s. This image shows the Ku Klux Klan, which was an extremist racist group at the time. We're going back here, we're tracing back the racist attitudes in the 1930s when the novel is set, all the way to slavery. Now, black people were originally brought from Africa to America in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, forcibly transported across the Atlantic in horrible conditions in slave ships, and sold to work on plantations, sugar and cotton mainly, in the Caribbean and in the southern states of America. No rights at all. They're regarded as possessions, even more like animals or machines by the white community, by the white owners. They were traded and sold just like goods. Even after the abolition of slavery in 1865, the blacks were still almost powerless. White people had too much to lose to allow black people any rights, so they were very protective and defensive of their superiority as they saw it. Now, nothing was equal. Blacks had the worst of everything, whilst the white community had the best. Now, such was the hatred of the blacks by the white community, especially during the Great Depression, when money was tight for everyone, that it was common for blacks to be lynched or hanged by a mob, as we see the gang arrive at the county jail to lynch Tom Robinson. So that is a very realistic threat. Now, segregation and injustice. As I say, even after slavery was abolished, still these attitudes still very prevalent in the southern states in America at that time in the 30s. Although 50% of the population of southern towns were